This episode is sponsored by Kim Smiley Jewelry, which you can discover at kimsmiley.com. It's not just jewelry, it's a badge of honor. Arsen Ostrovsky is a renowned human rights attorney and CEO of the International Legal Forum, where he is leading the global coalition of lawyers fighting for Israel and the Jewish people after the October 7th massacre by Hamas. Arsen has been at the helm of a number of groundbreaking lawsuits and appearances before international tribunals. A regular columnist for Newsweek magazine and The Hill, Arsen has a social media reach in the tens of millions. Arsen, welcome to Empathy Empire.
Thank you for having me.
I'm so happy you're here. You just arrived from Israel.
Well, actually from the US, but I've been traveling around the US and now Canada for the last week and a half, but I did come from Tel Aviv.
How are you sleeping since October the 7th?
You know what, I'm sleeping far better now. In the first few months, certainly it was tough because you're in a state of war. You're fighting, you have a family. I have two small children as well. At the same time, obviously, my work is focused on the battle for Israel in the courtroom, in the public arena, and it's impossible to escape. And you know, the information, the jarring scenes were non-stop, certainly in the beginning, still very much so now. So it hasn't been an easy process, but it's one that'll take a lot of time certainly for personal healing as well for all of us, you know, for the entire country.
You weren't always a human rights lawyer. You started off as a criminal lawyer, I understand. Tell us about the transition from criminal to human rights.
So I started off as a criminal lawyer initially in Australia, but then I practiced as an insurance litigator for most of my litigation career, certainly in Australia. And, you know, that seems like a world away from today for fighting for Israel in the international tribunals and filing, lawsuits, war crimes claims as well. So certainly, entire different world. And for me, the turning point was in 2009, if you remember the Mavi Marmara incident, when the flotilla was sailing from Turkey at the time to try and break into Gaza. And I remember at the time we had won this huge lawsuit, like this multi-million dollar precedent-setting lawsuit. And I thought, okay, you know what, that's nice, but tomorrow's going to be another one and another one and another one. And at the same time, I was involved with a small group of people that arranged a huge rally for Israel to support the soldiers, to support the Jewish community, because it went under immense attack in the public arena, rallies, in a lot of ways similar to what we're seeing today, but this is 2009 now. So seeing that response, seeing the necessity of standing up for Israel, for my Jewish community as well, I've found something deeply purposeful behind that, and that really led me ultimately on a path to Israel advocacy, Aliyah, and really the kind of work that I'm doing today.
So you were living in Australia at the time when you were doing that work?
I was living in Australia. Then before I moved to Israel, which was in 2012, I'd actually practiced in the US for a bit, including working within the United Nations system as well. And we know that the United Nations is not exactly the best friend of our people. We normally say there's two things certain in life: death, taxes. The third is Israel will always be found guilty at the UN. But being upfront, going to these meetings, and this was the beginning of the Arab Spring, beginning of the process that the Palestinians were trying to apply for statehood. So to go there and to see firsthand the vitriol, the hatred, how the most even mundane of gatherings are turned into an assault on Zionism was eye-opening and in so many ways. So that was about 2011 and 12, and then I finally made the move to Israel.
So did you have to do any retraining to go from criminal to human rights?
I didn't. I can't say a lot of the work that I remember from whether it's criminal practice or insurance litigation, has stayed with me. But what has stayed with me is the ability to construct an argument, is the ability to present a case. And I think that, it's such a central tenets of what we do in terms of Israel advocacy, in terms of standing up for Israel. We have to construct not only the case, but then we also have to find a way to present it and to communicate it and communicate to different audiences, not just judges and tribunals, but also, lawmakers, media, the Jewish community itself, and the mainstream society. So I think those skills have certainly stood me in good stead.
Did you ever imagine that we would have seen this extraordinarily meteoric rise in anti-Semitism?
No, I don't think. I'd like to think we never would have thought of that. It's only, it's the Holocaust is not that far away. I'm sorry, let me rephrase it. The Holocaust is not something that occurred so far away in distant memory, and yet here we are, where anti-Semitism is not only at some of the highest levels it has been since the Holocaust, but also what happened on October 7 was the single greatest massacre of Jews since the Holocaust itself. So I don't think anyone could have certainly imagined where we are today. And for me, I sort of always go back to there's the famous quote by Lord Rabbi Jonathan Sacks, the former chief rabbi of the UK, who passed away a number of years ago. And he gave this talk in the European Parliament about anti-Semitism as a mutating virus.
Yes, I remember that.
His quote in it, which stayed with me, since 2016, he spoke about, how in the Middle Ages they came for us, for Jews, because of our religion. In the 19th, 20th century, they came for us because of our race, the pogroms, the Holocaust. And today they come for us because of our nation state, Israel. But throughout time, throughout the generations, there's been one constant: the refusal and denial of us to live as free and equal human beings as Jews. So whether it's us as Jewish individuals or Israel as a Jewish state, it's the same kind of hatred, same kind of rejectionism.
So that's really interesting. I love Rabbi Sacks, and I was just reading one of his books actually this week. One of the things that I was thinking about was Hamas and the charter of Hamas, and how I don't think a lot of people understand this, especially TikTok warriors and people like that. But Hamas's goal is not just to eradicate Jews in the state of Israel; it's to eradicate every last Jew around the world. One of my questions for you is: did you predict this attack by Hamas, or were you taken by surprise by what happened?
Well, I don't think anyone predicted that. Certainly, had it been predicted, then it would not have happened. And there will be, and there are a lot of questions that need to be answered in terms of the intelligence failures and how this was allowed to happen. And there are investigations on foot already, and certainly they are continuing. There will be a reckoning on that. From my perspective, it's something that happened, and my focus is, how do we prevent it from happening, and how do we explain the situation to the broader world? So I don't think, we definitely didn't anticipate this, and in terms of the scale, in terms of the sheer barbarism, the cruelty, unprecedented wanton cruelty that we've seen, it's been certainly unprecedented, probably since the Holocaust itself.
So a lot of information that I get is off social media. I don't look at TikTok, but I look at Instagram and I look at the news on social media. And one of the things that I read very early on after October 7th was that there was rumblings and whispering about a possible imminent attack from Hamas. The women who were the observers at Nahal Oz were looking, and they were seeing drills, and there was almost like a sense of hubris on the part of the Israeli government that something of the magnitude that happened could have actually happened. So from your perspective, were there rumblings that you heard, or you were just, because you said you weren't surprised, like you everyone was surprised. Was everyone surprised? Because from what I've read, some people knew that there was something that was being planned. They just didn't necessarily understand the scale or the magnitude of the plan.
Look, there was certainly, I would say, indications from an intelligence perspective. Obviously, that's not something that I or we, as in outside the say the military or political echelon, would have been aware of. But there are certainly a lot of indications about possible movements and plans and intelligence gathering. But obviously, it's how that was then interpreted within the Israeli political and military echelon, and what actions were or were not taken, including some of which you spoke about. But at the end of the day, October 7 did happen. It is a day that obviously will live in infamy. It is a day that has changed our society. And I would just go one step further. I think how we view the West's war on terrorism as well, how we look at the role of Jews outside of Israel, so within Israel as well. So it's changed so many things on so many levels, and the reality is it happened. It's something that we have to deal with, and we have to learn from, and we have to find a way to move on as well.
So one of the things that I found very interesting is I was listening to a doctor. He was actually a dentist that was based in the prison where Sinwar was being held as a prisoner. And I think some people know this, but some don't. So maybe this is going to be news to some people. But he had a brain tumor. He went to the doctor at the prison, and they identified that there was something wrong. They took him to hospital, and they identified that he had a very significant brain tumor in his head. And they made the decision to perform surgery, which ultimately saved Sinwar's life. One of the things that certain commentators have said is that this idea of suicidal empathy on the part of the Jewish people. Like, why did they perform this surgery, this life-saving surgery? You could argue, of course, that doctors need to divorce their views and their personal opinions from their medical practice. But what do you think of that? The idea of suicidal empathy?
Um, I'm not sure if I'd term it that way, but I think it certainly does underscore that we are ultimately a moral people, a moral society. Hamas themselves, including Sinwar, have openly said that they value death as much as we value life, and that ultimately, therein lies sort of the real difference. We will treat, including even Hamas terrorists, the families of Ismail Haniyeh, of Yahya Sinwar himself. We will go to unprecedented lengths and extremes to avoid harm to Palestinian civilians in Gaza, to the extent that we give them advance notice of where we are going in order to avoid causing them harm, to the potential risk and harm to our own soldiers. We are setting up hospitals, providing them medical treatment, and that includes to those that fall on the hurt in combat as well. I don't know of any other army anywhere in the world that has gone or is going to such extremes and such lengths. So I don't think anyone has been as, albeit as imperfect. This is a war, and in fog of war, unfortunately, civilians get hurt, they lose their lives. But at the end of the day, whereas for us, every civilian tragedy, every civilian death, is a tragedy. For Hamas, every civilian death is a strategy, and I think that's a large difference, sort of, to who we are and who they are.
Part of your work is that you are trying to seek out justice towards Hamas, and you're filing certain lawsuits against them. Talk to me about that.
Sure. The beauty of the law is that it allows us to provide a semblance of justice to the victims first and foremost, and also to hold the perpetrators accountable and those that support the perpetrators as well. And I should say, we're fighting this on a legal battlefront, but we, as in Israel, and the Jewish community in some ways as well, this is a war that we're fighting on multiple battlefronts, not only on the ground in Gaza where the soldiers are, it's also in the legal arena where we're fighting, also in the digital social media arena, on the campus arena, in halls of parliament, and so on. But we're fighting in the legal arena because that is where we can effect change. That is where we, as ILF, where we have 4,000 plus lawyers around the world, including many here in Canada as well. So in the days, for example, after and weeks after the massacre, we filed one of the first war crimes claims against not only the Hamas leadership, but also the Palestinian Authority and Iran. Iran, of course, being the primary along with Qatar, the primary sponsor of Hamas. Iran are the ones that Hamas answered to. Iran is the one that we know now that helped provide them with weapons, training, guidance, and also instructions as well, whom they coordinated. So we filed in the first few weeks already a claim against them for war crimes, crimes against humanity, for genocide, which you spoke about as well, for a lot of the the rape, sexual assault crimes as well. But then, sort of in the months after that, we also took a strategic decision that, we need to pursue Hamas 100%. But the reality is holding them accountable or enforceable is not the easiest in practice. I don't believe that Yahya Sinwar will necessarily be tried in a courtroom anytime soon. This will not be like an Eichmann trial. He will either meet his fate or he will likely remain in the tunnels. We don't know. So I don't think you're going to see a courtroom trial necessarily unfold, albeit he certainly does deserve the justice that is forthcoming to him. But we did make the decision that we need to also pursue all those that are aiding, abetting, supporting, and funding Hamas. With those with whom we can affect change, where we can hold them accountable, where we can provide some kind of element of justice to the victims and create a level of deterrence. For example, we filed together with our partners in the US claim against SJP, Students for Justice in Palestine, in the US, which are not only fomenting so much of the violence on campus, but also acting effectively as a campus arm of Hamas. We filed a claim against one of the top cryptocurrency companies for allowing their platform to be used by Hamas and Islamic Jihad to fundraise tens of millions of dollars. And just recently, we filed a claim against one of the organizations that was involved in holding the hostages who we rescued last month. If you remember, there was the 4 hostages we rescued. There was Noah, and then there were the 3 male hostages, and they were being held captive by a so-called journalist and his father, the physician. So that journalist was employed by a Palestinian publication, but that falls under an American charity. So we sued the charity for employing him and providing material support, and we filed a claim against, related to UNRWA as well, which has become inseparable to Hamas. So all these claims together, and there will be more to come, are a way to provide a semblance of justice for the victims, to hold those that are aiding, abetting, supporting Hamas accountable, but also to not just create a level of deterrence, but to change the legal narrative as well, in terms of holding accountable those that really ought to be accountable for not just the crimes, but supporting the crimes as well.
Are these lawsuits all filed at the International Criminal Court, or are they filed sometimes in the United States or in Canada?
Most of the ones have been filed in the United States, federal lawsuits. One of the first ones we filed against for war crimes specifically, that was in The Hague. We're looking at filing a number of claims in Europe and South America as well, and that will be in those jurisdictions. We're also very fortunate to have very close relationships with allies and partners here in Canada as well, and have been assisting and counseling on a number of lawsuits and claims here as well.
Who funds this? Are you a nonprofit organization?
We are. So the International Legal Forum is a nonprofit organization. We're based in Tel Aviv, based in Israel. We have 4,000 plus amazing lawyers around the world who are, so active, so committed, so passionate.
Volunteers?
All volunteers, and they volunteer in different ways. Some provide pro bono legal services, like with some lawsuits. Some provide educational services. Some will provide legal advice. It's really an incredible, amazing group of lawyers who want to make a difference, who understand the urgency and the purpose of the mission. But we're a nonprofit. We have some amazing donors and people who also believe in the mission and the ability of the law to make a difference.
Do you think we're ever going to be able to completely eliminate Hamas? Is that even possible? Because isn't it more than, it's not just a group, it's not just people, it's a mindset.
You're right. It's a good question. And, a lot of the discussion from the first day has been, how do we achieve victory? Israel set a goal of, first and foremost, returning the hostages, 120 are still being held captive, and victory over Hamas. But how you define victory is very interesting. I don't believe we can 100% eliminate Hamas, because it's not only a terrorist group, and like you said, it's also an ideology. It's a movement as well. So I think victory in this sense is eliminating their capability of committing anything like this, eliminating their political infrastructure, their ability to govern. And I think if we look at it in those terms, I think we're well advanced on the way to victory. Hamas has been decimated. They have barely 1 battalion left in Rafah. Yahya Sinwar, some of the Hamas leaders are still alive, including those in Doha, in Qatar, those that are underground. Just the other week or the other day, we struck one of the senior heads of Hamas, Mohammed Daif, who's also one of the masterminds of the actual massacre itself. But Hamas as a movement is remaining. And then the next step will also become, well, how do we defeat the ideology? How do we de-radicalize the community there, which has really grown over the years. You spoke about the Hamas Charter, which does actually call for genocide, for violence, for incitement, for hatred, not just of Israel but of Jews. How do we eradicate that from the mindset? That's a far more complex and difficult long-term battle, as well as who's going to be governing Gaza, and how. From my perspective, a lot of people, and the biggest question I sort of find is the day after, and the world moved on from October 7th very fast. We have not. We are still stuck in the morning of October 7th, and will be in the morning of October 7th until every last hostage returns and Hamas is defeated.
I'm getting emotional talking about it. One of my family members, my first cousin Josh, so my mom's sister Frima lives in Israel, and her son Josh is married to a woman named Gayut, and her brother is Almog, who was rescued a month ago, as you just spoke about. And so I was able to get a very intimate kind of perspective on what was happening with the hostages. And I don't think that I've really slept since October the 7th, and I know that a lot of other people feel the same way. But I wanted to talk to you because you're having dealings with the hostages. You have contact with the hostages, and one of the things that I was wondering, I know that you're a lawyer and you have a certain level of objectivity, obviously, as a lawyer, and rationality and all those different things, but it has to impact you as a human being to be dealing with this assault on the Jewish people and dealing with individuals who have experienced pain and suffering as a result of this terrorist organization. How does that impact you as Arsen, the person, not Arsen, the attorney, but just as a human being, and as a dad and a husband?
It goes to the core of who I am. Yes, I'm a lawyer, but as you said, I'm also a husband and a father, and my primary duty is to protect my children. When the rocket started at 6:28 that Saturday morning, um, you know, I ran with my wife. I picked up our oldest. She was 6.5. My wife picked up our younger one, and we rushed to the shelter. And we did that, I don't know how many times. And then at the first dash, I think the sixth, the seventh dash, the shelter, and we live in an apartment building, so we can't get down and to the safe room. So we're in the hallway with other children, with other families. And my daughter, who's 6.5, looks at me in those puppy eyes and says, "Abba, why do they hate us? Why are they doing this?" I have to answer this to a 6-year-old. No father, no parent should answer that. On my daughter's birthday recently, she blew out the candles on a cake, and I asked, "Sweetie, what did you wish for?" Thinking she'd say, a doll, a dress, a family trip. No, she said, "Abba, I just want all the soldiers and the hostages to come back." It moves you to the core. This happened on October 7th. On a few days later, I was in Kibbutz Be'eri in the south. There are things I've seen I will never unsee. The stench of death is unmistakable. The smell of gun residue. The moments, I'm walking through and the blood hasn't dried yet to think of what happened. You asked me before about how I sleep. For the first 2 or 3 months, I did not sleep because I was so overwhelmed in the work, in the intensity of the information. But I knew that the moment I close my eyes, my mind goes to a very, very dark place. So it's affected all of us to the core in every imaginable way. But you know what? We don't have a choice. We have to fight. And not only we have to fight, we have to win. And we don't. It's not a luxury that we have to sit on the sidelines. We as Israelis, as Jews in the diaspora as well, we have to ask, what kind of a future do we want for us, for our country, for our community, for our people, for our children? Before I flew out, my youngest, who's 3 now, and she was 2.5 then, we walked past the hostage square. So we live very close to the hostage square. And we live across from a hospital as well. So when the planes start, or the helicopters start coming in, my daughter knows to come to me and says, Abba, they're bringing more soldiers in, because you can see them landing on the helipad. But as we're going past the hostage square, you see that wall of posters, of pictures of the hostages. The younger one, who's now 3, asks, "What are those pictures?" And her sister, before I had a chance to answer, her sister, now 7, She takes her hand, points them, and says they're waiting to come back home to their imas and abbas, and Abba's trying to help bring them back. My heart sank because I'm a lawyer, meant to be strong. We're all meant to be strong, but our primal urge is to protect our children. And we can't always do that. There are moments when, I'm doing a TV interview or I'm out and the siren is there. And my thought is, where are my children? I hope they're safe. I pray they're safe. There are times where I was walking down the street with my youngest in a stroller and there's a siren. What do you do? You got to run. You don't have a lot of time. This is what it's been like for us. And by the way, we're the lucky ones in Tel Aviv. And I use the word very loosely because, at the end of the day, I think we're all survivors. 9+ million people in Israel, one way or another, we're all survivors.
I think even more than that, I think just the Jewish people, it's in our DNA to be survivors. It's just, our ancestral trauma is in our DNA.
No, we've survived for 3,000+ years, everyone from Pharaoh to Hitler, and we will survive Hamas because, quite frankly, we don't have a choice. There is but one Jewish state and one Jewish state only, and we are fighting for our survival. And the quote that I often use, people talk about victory. It's quite strange, ironic to me that Israel is the only democracy that has repeatedly been denied the right to achieve victory against enemies who seek no less than our annihilation and have sought to carry that out, including Hamas most recently. The whole, as I said, the world moves on, and straight away it's, Israel is acting disproportionately. You should be doing that, or you should be conceding that it should be doing X, Y, and Z. And, I look at, for example, someone like Winston Churchill, who, when he became Prime Minister in 1940, in his first speech as leader to the House of Commons, he was asked, what is the British policy against the Nazis? And he said, I can answer in one word: victory. Victory at all costs, victory in spite of all terror, victory however long and hard the road may be, for without victory there is no survival. And that's the exact same thing to us. And by the way, Hamas is no different to the Nazis in so many ways. They both, in terms of the barbarism, the intentions is exactly the same. The only difference is whereas the Nazis sought to, in some ways, hide their monstrosity, Hamas was wearing GoPros and streaming it live and doing so gleefully, and there is no excuse. But there are those who are still denying what happened, those who are still denying that the rape occurred or massacres occurred or that children were murdered, entire families were tied and burned. There are those with sick, unhinged, utter Jew hatred that we're still seeing today. And it's becoming far more acceptable in mainstream society, which we need to fight back against.
But what's so shocking is that it's not just the extreme people who are saying that these things didn't happen. And as you said, Hamas was wearing GoPros to document it. We're seeing the radicalization of just of all kinds of different echelons of society, especially like on university campuses, which we touched on as well. And what's so interesting to me is how this narrative of that Israel is committing a genocide and the denial of the rapes that happened on October 7th, like, what is behind this? What do you make of this? When there's evidence, you're a lawyer, there's evidence that this has happened, right? You're going to go into these trials with evidence, documentation from the people who perpetrated the crimes, and yet people are still denying it. What do you make of that? How do you explain that?
That's a tough battle because we will win the war on the ground. We will win the war against Hamas. But this war of narratives is something very, it's far more difficult to fight. Look, in one way, it's sheer numbers. There's 9.5 million people in Israel, 15, 16 million Jews around the world. And we certainly have some incredible allies and partners who are standing up for us and fighting these lies. But ultimately, there are so many more those who are our detractors, those who in so many ways subscribe to the view that you hold, that you suggested is being held. And then we live in a day and age of social media where everything is, 24/7 mushroom, but we are fighting a war of narratives. And I think we need to underscore that this, by the way, isn't just a war between Israel and Hamas. It's a war between Israel as a frontier of the West. This is a war between good and evil, those who believe in freedom and democracy and the rule of law and dignity of life and humanity, and those who have no humanity those who are barbarians, those who defend them. And we need to sort of highlight that because, there's a real difficulty, I think, or refusal today to differentiate between us and Hamas. You saw that in the National Criminal Court. You see that in the press, where there's this kind of grotesque moral equivalence between Israel, a liberal democracy fighting back against, one of the great evils of our time, and Hamas, this bloodthirsty terrorist group who are open in their intentions to commit genocide and committed the most barbaric crimes since the Holocaust itself. And you're seeing this war of narratives played out online. You're seeing it played out in the mainstream press. You're seeing it played out in parliaments, in halls of Congress, in diplomatic arena, and you're seeing it on campus as well. Certainly in the US, where we saw the encampments, the protests, the sheer vitriol. I mentioned one of our lawsuits was against the group Students for Justice in Palestine as being an arm of Hamas and fomenting a lot of this and providing that support. And we're seeing that now also a lot of that, being copied here in Canada as well, with the encampments in different universities. It is tough being a Jewish student. It is even tough being a Zionist student on campus, to proudly wear your Magen David, to wear this yellow symbol, because you will get attacked. And, we need to do also, I think, a far better job in providing support to a lot of these students certainly as well, because it is not easy being on campus, and we recognize that, and we need to do far more in terms of providing them that support as well.
There's a group of students at Harvard that's suing the university. Is that affiliated with your group, with the Forum, or is that a separate lawsuit that's being filed by those students?
No, that's a separate lawsuit.
Okay. One of the things that I want to touch on, because we're talking about narrative, is this narrative that the IDF are bloodthirsty. They want to kill as many Palestinians as possible. We obviously negate this because we do everything we can, as you mentioned before, to save lives. We drop pamphlets, we make calls. The IDF does all these things to save civilian lives as much as they can, but it's war, right? And we do more in the loss of any life. But one of the things that I want to talk to you about is this narrative that we're bloodthirsty, because I was having a conversation with someone on Facebook, someone who I've known for a very long time, who's a pro-Palestinian advocate. And one of the things that I said to him was that Israel has never started a war. We have never started any of the wars. And he said, go educate yourself. So talk to me about this notion of Israel as the warmonger and unpack that for me.
This is not a war we wanted. This is a massacre that was imposed upon us. On October 7th, which was a Jewish holiday as well, mind you, we were asleep. We had a ceasefire. People talking about a ceasefire now. We had a ceasefire on October 6th, by the way, as well. This is not something we sought, we wanted. This is a war. Violence is never something that we seek. On the contrary, we have gone above and beyond to make incredible concessions throughout time, throughout the decades, throughout the years, to have peace, including with our enemies and including with our neighbors. We saw that with the Abraham Accords. We've seen that with Egypt and Jordan. We've seen that with the endless number of offers that we have put forward to the Palestinians as well. This is not a war that we wanted, but we were left with no choice on October 7th when Hamas invaded Israel with thousands of fighters and terrorists, including some Palestinian civilians as well, and committed the most barbaric, heinous crimes, which we don't need to repeat here again. Israel, like any democracy, like any sovereign nation, including like Canada, will do whatever and must do whatever it takes in order to respond, in order to defeat this terrorist group and to bring back our loved ones. And as we said before, we have gone above and beyond to levels unprecedented under international law. No other army in the history of urban warfare has gone to these lengths in order to protect Palestinian civilians. We care more about Palestinian civilians than Hamas. It is Hamas that holds our own people as shields. It is Hamas that has turned every single hospital and school in Gaza into a command and control center, into a weapon storage depot, into launching pads against us. We're doing everything humanly possible in order to avoid loss of life, because for us, every civilian death is a tragedy. For them, for Hamas, every civilian death is a strategy. And I think therein lies the real difference between us and them.
Talk to me about the IDF. Who is the IDF? Who are the soldiers? Give me an explanation of that, if you could, please.
So in Israel, army military service is generally it's compulsory service, and most of those soldiers are young kids. You know, here in Canada, when you turn 18, you either go to college, you go to university, you go on your gap year, you go traveling, you go to, to find yourself. In Israel, when you turn 18, you go into the army. You serve at least 3 years, some serve more because this is where we live. There is a necessity. We have, we don't have the luxury of having the United States on one end of our border and surrounded by oceans on the other. We're surrounded by enemies that are hell bent on our annihilation. And so we have to fight because we don't have a choice. There are those who seek no less than our annihilation to push us into the water. So when they turn 18, they have to go train, they have to go fight. That is an unfortunate reality of life. But when October 7th hit as well, when that happened, given the enormity, the magnitude, the not only those that were already serving had to go fight, but those in the reserves, because in Israel, once you finish serving your compulsory service, you then go into broader, you go into society, you go study, you work, and then every couple of days a year or a few weeks a year, depending on which unit you served in, you do military reserves training until you hit a certain age. And again, given the magnitude of what happened and the mission ahead of us, so many from the reserves were not only called up, but they volunteered. There were those who were on holidays in the United States, in Canada, North America, traveling across Asia, that packed what they're doing before they were even called up, and they said, we have to go back, we have to fight, we have to bring back the hostages, we have to bring back Hamas. So right now you have everyone from 18, 19, 20-year-old, barely teenagers on the front lines fighting, and you also have 30, 40, 50-year-olds who have day jobs, who are CEOs of startup companies, who have families, from an entire cross spectrum of Israeli society, by the way, from religious and secular, left-wing and right-wing. Also, by the way, Jews and Christian and Arab and Muslim and Druze as well, that are part of this really mosaic and tapestry of Israeli society, are also fighting in one army that represents the entirety of our society, irrespective of the background. And even the victims, they weren't all Jews. There were Muslim victims and Christian victims and Druze victims. The stories of incredible heroism. And, we have to also remember that as well.
I think it's also important to note that 20% of Israeli society are Arab Israelis that have full and equal rights under the law, because a lot of people do not know that, and they think it's an apartheid state. So I think that also bears mentioning. One of the things that I found super emotional was during the rescue of the 4 hostages, there was a commander named Aaron Zamora, I think I'm pronouncing his name right, who was killed during that operation. And I saw an image of that soldier's, one of his parents, hugging Noah Agramani's dad. And I just thinking about that image, it just completely breaks me up, because these soldiers left their families to fight for these hostages that were stolen from a music concert that was a peace and love concert in the middle of the desert. The sacrifice that's made by these soldiers, and that he's leaving little children behind, this soldier. I just found that such an incredibly emotional moment that really said everything about the way that the Jewish people value life.
The stories of sacrifice and heroism and courage and bravery is really, it's unimaginable. There are, including soldiers, including families, including parents who literally shielded their babies, their children with their bodies, and took bullets, and only by act of God and grace their children survived and are now as orphans, but because their parents put their lives on the line. There are images of everyday citizens dropping whatever they're doing, running to fight terrorists when they are outnumbered, to the dozens, and they knew, the sacrifice, the risk they were putting themselves at, and they paid with their life. They made the ultimate sacrifice to save life. For us, to save one life, it's as if you save
the world
and entire people. So the sacrifice, the courage, and including with the soldiers now today that are fighting every single day, that are on the ground in Gaza, that are going into these tunnels, not knowing what awaits them, in order to try and save our hostages, to bring them back, not only the living ones, but the dead as well, for burial. The sacrifice is just unimaginable. The heroism is just so inspiring, and the resilience of us as a people, as a nation, is ultimately what gives me hope.
Me too. I want to talk to you about your past life when you worked at the UN, because you're an insider at the UN, so you have a different perspective. What's your feeling now in terms of what's happening at the UN? Like, as someone who's worked at the UN, what do you make of this? What's happening there? It seems like a big charade to me.
Charade's a good way to put it. The UN was created in the wake of the Holocaust, and it has today become the single greatest platform for Jew hatred, anti-Semitism, and Holocaust distortion, and even denial to some extent. We say that there are two things in life: death and taxes. The third is that Israel will always be found guilty before the United Nations, and that is a sad reality of what we're facing. You have the Human Rights Council, for example, in Geneva, where Israel has been condemned more than almost the entire world put together. You have something of the UN General Assembly, which condemns Israel more times again than the world's worst human rights abusers, where the Palestinians enjoy this automatic majority. There's 193, 94 countries, of which about 50 plus are in the Organization of Islamic Nations. You add onto that some of the African and South American nations. It's an automatic majority. We face an uphill battle at the UN every single day, where they single us out, where they demonize us, where they vilify us, where they have yet to condemn Hamas, where they're yet to condemn Hezbollah, which is continuing, by the way, to fire rockets every single day, and where almost 100,000 people in the north of Israel have been displaced and made homeless and not allowed to return to the homes. The UN is yet to condemn even Hezbollah. So we know that the UN, sadly, is no longer a force for good. It is a force for the tyrants, for the terrorists and dictators, those forces of anti-democracies who hate everything that we as a Jewish nation stand for. But at the same time, as we know that, there are those who look at the UN and some of the committees and think of that as gospel, as if it's Moses on Mount Sinai receiving the Ten Commandments, when they don't understand and fully appreciate the sheer vitriol, the hatred, the demonization, the attacks on Israel, the acquiescence to these terror groups. So we need to also call out the UN for this hypocrisy, for these double standards as well.
You were there in January 2024 when The Hague was having the trial for Israel on genocide charges. What was that like to be in that room?
It was surreal. It was this sort of Orwellian experience. The very term genocide itself was coined by a Polish Jewish jurist, Raphael Lemkin, to describe the attempted systematic annihilation of the Jewish people after the Holocaust or during the Holocaust. And yet here we are, and that very term genocide is now being weaponized and subverted against us in the wake of the single greatest massacre of Jews since that very Holocaust. It is obscene. It is an entire perversion of the international legal order as we know it. It is not Israel ought to have been on trial there. It is Hamas. And I would add one more, South Africa, for embracing Hamas itself. Israel is not committing genocide. We have provided over 1 million tons of food. We are doing everything possible to avoid harm to civilian casualties. Our goal is defeating Hamas and bringing back our hostages. Unfortunately, innocent people die in a fog of war, but it is Hamas that is responsible for every single one of those deaths, both Israeli and civilians. So to now weaponize the very international legal order is, quite frankly, grotesque. It's offensive, and I think it undermines the very existing structure that we've really relied upon since World War II and since the Holocaust.
Speaking of grotesque, the Me Too movement and this notion of Me Too unless you're a Jew.
Yeah.
Thoughts on that?
Probably one of the biggest disappointments. I think since October 7, what transpired, the attacks on women, on girls, the magnitude of the rape. I won't go into details for your listeners, but knowing to some extent it's jarring, gives me, um, it's difficult to talk about. Um, to see the abandonment of our women is inexcusable. It's unconscionable. Whether it's at the UN Women Agency, whether it's the Me Too movements, the fact that rape is resistance is now a word, a phrase that we're being used. Is no different to Holocaust denial. It is unconscionable. It is inexcusable. And quite frankly, all those that fail to stand with Israeli women, including the ones that are being held still captive and everything we've known about them, and that have now been held captive over 9 months. I don't have to tell you what happens after 9 months, is jarring beyond any norm of acceptability. And that is something that we will have to live with, and remember those that have failed and refused to stand with us, and worse yet, denied or sought to justify some of these abhorrent actions.
Arsen, I want to move into talking a little bit about advocacy.
Mhm.
What makes a good Israel advocate? I know that you won an award for being one of the top Israel advocates in the world. What, in your opinion, makes a good Israel advocate? How can we equip students to be better Israel advocates on campus?
I think we've been blessed with some incredible advocates, and I should say both Jewish and non-Jewish, as well. And it's not easy today to be an advocate for Israel. It's not easy today to stand up as a Zionist, whether it's online, whether it's on campus, whether it's in parliaments and on the street. So we also have to recognize that those that have done that, and it's not easy. So it does take an element of courage. I think that's important today. It shouldn't, but it does take an element of courage to speak out for Israel, because it's not fashionable in some circles. What takes a good advocate is, I think, someone who has passion, who understands the facts, who learns the facts, who's able to communicate, who's able to recognize whom we're communicating to, because the way we communicate is something different to different segments of society. The way you speak to a student will be different to the way you speak to someone else, to the media, to parliament, to Jews, non-Jews, from progressive, from conservative side. So you have to know your audience as well. I think we have to be a lot more proactive today. We cannot just sit back. We cannot just respond, because if we do that, that is all we will be doing. We need to be proactive. We need to be passionate and forceful. We need to be storytellers as well. We need to tell the story of Israel, certainly the story both before and certainly after October 7. That this is not a war that we saw. This is a war that was forced upon us. This is one that we have to wage, that we are a liberal democracy fighting for to bring back our hostages, to bring back our loved ones. One of the things I've found that has been most effective for me is to personalize and contextualize what is happening. One example I can give you is, certainly in the early days of the war, I had an interview with a Canadian news channel. I forget which one now. And they asked about the situation in Israel. And I had said that right now, something like 5 million plus people across Israel are under threat of rocket fire. 5 million people in Canada is the combined population of Montreal, Ottawa, and I believe Toronto as well. This is the reality for us, in the same way as what would you do, if it was your daughter that's being held captive, or your son, or your father, or your loved ones. So it's not easy being an advocate for Israel today, but it's not a battle that we can afford to sit on the sidelines.
What can regular people in the diaspora do, Jews and allies, in your opinion?
It's important also, you said allies as well, that it shouldn't be just Jews as well. We have to form, and we've Not just the allies, the real partners that we had before October 7, but also the partnerships we formed since, in Canada. There's some amazing allies, from Christian groups to interfaith groups to Indigenous Canadians as well, who certainly understand what we're doing. So I think forming these allies is critical. When you ask also what we as individuals can do, there's so much. We can be active online. It doesn't take a lot to post something online. You have to be prepared that it can be a cesspool of and vitriol of hate. So you have to be able to withstand that. But it is a battle that's being waged, and certainly when you're looking at the millennial age, that they get their information from Instagram, from TikTok, from social media. They don't open up a newspaper, they go online. So we have to be active online. We have to be able to speak to our elected officials. These are the people that are making policy. These are the people that are pronouncing judgments. These are the people that are fighting over whether to issue embargoes and withhold weapons to Israel, or whether to speak out and support Israel. They need to know what is happening. You, as constituents, need to inform them. We need to be informed about the facts about what is happening as well, and also then not just understanding the situation, but then how to communicate it as well. So there's certainly a lot that can be done, whether it's being online, whether it's writing letters to your editor, whether it's speaking to your elected officials, to those in your community, in your workplace, in your boardroom. I think that's all critical. But again, it's something that we don't have the luxury to sit on the sidelines. It's a battle that we have to fight, and we have to fight on every platform.
And we need allies.
Definitely.
And we appreciate allies.
We certainly do, and we need them to know. I think also it's important that we appreciate them, because it's not always easy standing up for us. We get it. We don't have the luxury of otherwise. They can sit on the sidelines, but those that choose to stand with us, those that choose to stand with the Jewish people, with the state of Israel, they too are making a sacrifice, and we need to also embrace them, and we need to find a way to amplify their voices too.
I want to end this by talking personally with you. You have 300,000 followers on Twitter, or X. I think Elon Musk is going back and forth whether it's going to be Twitter again or X. How do you fortify yourself against the vitriol and against the hate that you receive as an advocate online?
It's easy for me to save a thick skin when it comes to that, because I know it's not easy for everyone. I can post the most mundane thing, and it will automatically be turned into the most obscene attack on me. So I choose in some way to ignore that. And it's something I've done over many years now. In some cases, I'll choose to make an example of that and highlight that, so that people understand the hate that we're seeing, the vitriol, the conspiracy theories, how misinformed people are, and the magnitude of sometimes of quite frankly outright lies. There are those that go even above and beyond that, and you can block them, you can report them. That's also an option. The online world, it can be a force for good, and it can be a force for hate. And so far, when it comes to Israel, certainly since October 7th, it has been an unhinged platform of hate, from Holocaust distortion to incitement to sheer adoration of Hamas, to denial of a lot of these claims that we're seeing, to most horrific pictures. But it can also be a force for good. It can allow us to present our case, to present our argument, to convey our thoughts, to create a narrative. I'll give you one example. I was recently in London, and I was going through Piccadilly Circus, which is, it's one of the most popular tourist attractions, thousands of people. And as I'm walking, a random stranger goes like that, "Arsen?" And, my first thought is, like, good Lord, like what's going to happen now? There's like thousands of people. No one will ever see me if anything happens. And it was a young Jewish kid. He said, I follow you online, and I just want to say I appreciate what you do. That meant the world to me, because at the same time as we have to go beyond the echo chambers, we have to try and find a way to have our arguments, our positions, our narrative resonate with those who maybe might be on the other side or might be in the middle, that might not necessarily inherently share our views. But we also have to find a way to support our own community as well, to give them that power, to give them that motivation, to know that they are not alone, that we are also with them as well. So I think that's also critical and something to me inspires to continue doing what I'm doing and what I think we're all doing in our own platforms.
I love that story. And I think what I would end with is that we also have to find ways to support ourselves, because the work that you're doing, I don't know how many lawsuits you have right now, but it seems like it's a lot.
It's a few, and there'll be more. And
There'll be more. So,
and they'll keep coming as long as we have to.
one of the things that I keep hearing from people in all different fields, and especially from Israelis, but also from people in the diaspora, is the sense of exhaustion and depletion. What I'd like to ask you is, how do you have empathy for yourself in order to fill your cup back up with all the work that you're doing in this area?
That's a good question. And honestly, it's one that I'm still trying to figure out myself. You speak about exhaustion. I'm exhausted. I'm not the only one. We have 9 million people that are exhausted, including those that are coming in and out of Gaza as well. Those that are on the front lines advocating for Israel are exhausted. I'm exhausted of having to explain and justify our actions. And quite frankly, I'm done with that. I'm not justifying or explaining anything, because we have nothing to explain. We have nothing to apologize for, because we're doing what any other country would do in our circumstances, in fighting back against this wanton terror and bringing back our loved ones, our captives. But it's not only physical exhaustion, it's a mental exhaustion. It's very difficult to escape. I live in Israel. It's everywhere, every breathing moment. The hostage square is near us. A hospital is near us. You turn on the TV, you turn on the internet, you go outside, there's posters, there's rallies. It is impossible to escape. And I think we need to find also ways to look after ourselves. We need to focus on rehabilitation and counseling, and that is something those that recognize we need that, and those that are still fighting, and whether fighting on the ground or whether fighting online or in the courtrooms, that are so engrossed in our work that we haven't paused. And I'll probably put myself in that latter category, but we certainly need to look after ourselves and our own mental well-being, because this is a battle that's going to be waged for a long time. It's not ending, sadly, anytime soon. So we need to be able to be ready for that. Whilst we fight, we also need to look after ourselves. We're not just soldiers and lawyers and advocates. We're also mothers, fathers, children, and parents as well.
Thank you so much for your time. I found this incredibly fascinating to hear from you as a lawyer on the front lines, and we really appreciate you being here. Thank you, Arsen.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate the discussion.
Hey everyone, this is Kim. Thanks for listening, and don't forget to subscribe.